My husband spent an entire business dinner telling his German client I was too stupid to understand anything, while I sat there understanding every single word in perfect German. I'm Jessica, 41 years old, and for 12 years I thought I knew the man sleeping next to me every night. James was a senior manager at a major tech company in Seattle, and I worked as a marketing coordinator. We had the house in Bellevue, the respectable careers, the carefully maintained social media presence that made everyone think we were living the dream. But the truth was, our marriage had become as cold as the Seattle rain. Somewhere between year 3 and year 7, we'd stopped being partners and started being roommates who occasionally attended the same events. The loneliness drove me to do something I'd been putting off since college. My grandmother had immigrated from Munich in the 1950s, and I'd always wanted to connect with that part of my heritage. When I mentioned learning German to James, he'd dismissed it with that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. He told me it was a waste of time, that I should focus on keeping our home organized instead. So I learned it anyway, in secret. Late nights with apps and podcasts while he worked in his home office. German novels without subtitles. Within 2 years, I was fluent. 3 weeks ago, everything came crashing down at a high-end German restaurant downtown. James needed me there to impress a potential business partner from Berlin. He made it clear I was just decoration, something to prove he had a stable family life. I wore the blue dress he picked out, smiled on cue, and prepared myself for another boring evening of being invisible. What I heard that night would change everything. And by everything, I mean my entire future. If you want to know how a woman who was treated like a decorative vase ended up destroying the man who underestimated her, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to take you through the most satisfying 3 weeks of my life. The restaurant was the kind of place where every detail screamed old money and tradition. Dark wood panels, white linen tablecloths, and waiters who moved like shadows. Mr. Dietrich was already seated when we arrived, a distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that had seen decades of business negotiations. James introduced me with a hand on my lower back, the gesture looking affectionate to anyone watching. Mr. Dietrich greeted me in heavily accented English, asking politely about my evening. I smiled and responded simply, playing the role James had assigned me, the pleasant wife who didn't understand the complexities of business dealings. Then the menus arrived, and James switched to German. I'd prepared myself for boredom, maybe some technical jargon I'd have to pretend not to hear. What I wasn't prepared for was the casual cruelty in my husband's voice when he thought I couldn't understand him. He started by apologizing for bringing me along, explaining to Mr. Dietrich that German business culture valued family presence at these dinners. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told this complete stranger that I didn't understand anything about the business world, that I was happy with my simple little life, that he handled all the important decisions and finances while I just maintained appearances. I took a sip of water, forcing my hand not to shake. The ice clinked against the glass, and I worried that sound alone would give me away. James continued talking, completely oblivious, ordering wine and making small talk about the Seattle tech scene. When Mr. Dietrich asked about financial stability for the potential European expansion, James actually laughed. That's when he dropped the real bomb. He told this man he'd been moving assets into offshore accounts without my knowledge, that if he needed to relocate to Europe for the promotion, he wouldn't be tied down by any complications. He used the word complications like he was talking about disposing of old furniture. Then came the part that nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. He mentioned Brittany from the finance department. 6 months, he said. He bragged about how refreshing it was to be with someone who understood his career ambitions, unlike his wife who couldn't even decide what to make for dinner. Every word felt like a physical blow. 12 years of marriage, reduced to a joke told over expensive German wine. I kept my eyes on my plate, mechanically cutting the chicken I'd ordered, chewing without tasting anything. My face felt frozen, muscles locked in that polite smile I'd perfected over years of corporate events and family gatherings where I felt invisible. Mr. Dietrich looked uncomfortable. I caught him glancing at me several times, his expression uncertain. Maybe he sensed something. Maybe he realized that a woman who'd been married for 12 years might understand more than her husband assumed. But James was too caught up in his own performance to notice. The dinner lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of listening to my husband dismantle our marriage, reveal financial crimes, and mock everything about my life. He talked about the offshore accounts in detail, banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. He mentioned that his lawyer had helped structure everything to be divorce-proof, or so he thought. He even joked about how easy it was to manipulate someone who trusted you completely. When dessert arrived, he pivoted to discussing the business deal, talking numbers and expansion plans. I ate my chocolate mousse in small, careful bites, my mind already 3 steps ahead. I was cataloging everything, filing away every detail, every account number he mentioned, every smug confession. On the drive home, James was euphoric. He told me he was certain the deal would go through, that Mr. Dietrich had been impressed. He actually thanked me for being there, said I'd played my part perfectly, that I hadn't even seemed bored, which was good because it would have been awkward if I'd started fidgeting or checking my phone. I told him it had been very educational. He assumed I meant the atmosphere, the fancy restaurant, the opportunity to dress up. He had no idea I meant every single word of German that had come out of his lying mouth. That night, I lay awake next to him, listening to him snore peacefully. He had no clue that the woman beside him had just heard her entire world collapse. But more importantly, he had no idea that same woman was already planning exactly how to rebuild it. By morning, I knew exactly who I needed to call first. I waited until James left for work before I made the phone call that would change everything. My hands were steadier than I expected when I pulled up Ashley Morrison's number in my contacts. We'd been close in college, both of us ambitious marketing majors who stayed up too late studying and dreaming about corner offices. She'd gone to law school instead, specializing in family law, and over the years we'd kept in touch through occasional lunches and holiday cards. Ashley picked up on the second ring. When I asked if she handled divorces, there was a brief pause before she told me to come to her office immediately. She heard something in my voice that couldn't wait for a scheduled appointment. Her office was in a sleek downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. She'd done well for herself. The receptionist showed me into a conference room, and Ashley walked in 3 minutes later, already holding a legal pad and wearing the expression of someone ready for battle. I told her everything, not the sanitized version I might have shared with a casual friend, but the raw truth. The dinner, the German conversation, every degrading word James had said, the offshore accounts, the affair with Brittany, the casual way he'd discussed disposing of our marriage like it was a failed business venture. Ashley didn't interrupt. She took notes in that precise handwriting I remembered from study sessions, underlining certain phrases, marking others with asterisks. When I finished, she looked up and told me this was actually good news, her exact words. Good news. Because James had handed me everything I needed to destroy him legally. She explained that Washington was a no-fault divorce state, but that didn't matter when it came to asset division. Hiding marital assets was fraud. Moving money to offshore accounts to avoid community property laws was fraud. And she knew exactly the kind of forensic accountant who could trace every dollar James thought he'd hidden cleverly enough. The affair with Brittany was just icing on an already substantial cake. It wouldn't impact the divorce itself, but it would definitely impact his professional life. Most major tech companies had strict ethics policies about relationships that created power imbalances or conflicts of interest. I left her office 3 hours later with a plan. Ashley had mapped out every step, every document I needed to locate, every piece of evidence that would hold up in court. She also warned me about something crucial. I needed to act normal. James couldn't suspect anything had changed until we were ready to strike. One wrong move, one suspicious question, one emotional confrontation, and he might start hiding assets more effectively or destroying evidence. That night, I had dinner ready when James got home. Chicken marsala, his favorite. He kissed my cheek absently, complained about a difficult meeting, and scrolled through his phone while eating. I asked about his day, listened to him talk about a project deadline, refilled his wine glass. Everything exactly as it had been for years. But while he was in the shower, I was in his home office with my phone, photographing every document I could access. Bank statements he'd left carelessly on his desk. Printouts of emails about business trips that I now knew had included Brittany. A notebook with what looked like account numbers and passwords scribbled in the margins. I worked methodically, hands steady, ears alert for the sound of the shower turning off. 3 years of feeling invisible had taught me how to move through our house like a ghost. I knew which floorboards creaked, which drawers stuck, exactly how long James spent in the bathroom each evening. Over the next week, I became a woman on a mission. Every morning after James left for work, I went through his office systematically. I found printouts of wire transfer confirmations, emails between him and someone named Marcus Hoffman, who appeared to be his offshore banking contact, and credit card statements showing hotel charges that matched his supposed business trips but included expenses for 2 people. The affair with Brittany was almost insulting in how cliched it was. Jewelry purchases on Valentine's Day when he'd told me he was too busy for dinner. Weekend trips to Portland and Vancouver that he'd claimed were solo research opportunities. Late-night texts that he'd explained as work emergencies, but which I now photographed showing messages that were definitely not about quarterly projections. Ashley's forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, met with me privately. I gave her copies of everything I'd found. She told me she'd need 2 weeks to trace the full extent of the offshore accounts, but that what I'd already provided was damning. James hadn't been as careful as he thought. He'd left digital footprints everywhere, probably because he genuinely believed I was too simple to understand financial complexity. That assumption was going to cost him everything. At home, I continued the performance. I smiled when James mentioned possibly relocating for work. I nodded sympathetically when he complained about office politics. I even had sex with him twice that week, hating every second, but knowing that maintaining normalcy was crucial to the plan's success. Meanwhile, I was building an empire of evidence that would tear his carefully constructed lies apart. Every document, every photograph, every traced wire transfer was another nail in his coffin. Patricia called me after 10 days with news that exceeded even Ashley's expectations. James had moved over $400,000 into 3 different offshore accounts. Money that was legally half mine, hidden away like I didn't deserve to know it existed. The final piece fell into place when I contacted James's company HR department anonymously, requesting information about their ethics policies regarding workplace relationships. The policy was crystal clear. Relationships between managers and subordinates required disclosure and approval from senior leadership. Violations could result in termination. On day 19, Ashley called me into her office. The divorce papers were ready. The fraud complaint was ready. The notification to James's company about ethics violations was ready. Everything was loaded and aimed directly at the life James had built on a foundation of lies and contempt. Ashley asked me one last time if I was certain. Once we filed, there would be no going back. James would know I'd been planning this, that the woman he'd dismissed as decoration had outsmarted him completely. I signed every page without hesitation. Then I told Ashley exactly how I wanted the papers delivered. Playing dumb might be the hardest role I've ever had to perform. Every morning I woke up next to James knowing exactly what he'd done, exactly what he thought of me, and exactly how I was going to dismantle his entire world. And every morning I had to smile at him over coffee and ask about his meeting schedule like nothing had changed. The week after I signed the divorce papers was the longest week of my life. Ashley had advised waiting until everything was perfectly positioned. Patricia needed time to finalize her forensic report. The process server needed to coordinate timing with the HR complaint filing. Everything had to happen simultaneously, so James couldn't start damage control before we'd struck every target. But that meant I had to keep living the lie he'd created for me. James came home excited one evening, telling me about the Berlin deal moving forward. Mr. Dietrich had approved the partnership, and James would likely be promoted to Director of European Operations. He'd be traveling more frequently, possibly relocating within the year. He talked about it like he was discussing the weather, completely casual about upending our lives without consulting me. Because in his mind, I had no say in decisions that actually mattered. I congratulated him, asked questions about the timeline, even suggested we celebrate with dinner at that expensive steakhouse he loved. He seemed pleased by my enthusiasm, told me he appreciated how supportive I was being about his career, how understanding I was about the demands of his job. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. What he didn't know was that Mr. Dietrich had already reached out to me. It happened 3 days after that dinner. I received a LinkedIn message from him, professional but pointed. He wrote that he'd been thinking about that evening at the restaurant, that something had troubled him about the interaction. He mentioned that his late wife had been American, and that she'd always reminded him that still waters run deep. Then he asked if I might be interested in discussing marketing opportunities for his company's American expansion. I stared at that message for a full hour before responding. Mr. Dietrich knew. Somehow he'd seen through James's performance, had noticed my carefully controlled reactions. Maybe he'd even suspected I understood German. His message was carefully worded, nothing that would seem inappropriate if anyone else read it, but the subtext was clear. He was offering me a lifeline. I wrote back professionally, thanking him for the consideration and saying I'd be very interested in learning more after I'd sorted out some personal matters. His response came within minutes. He told me to take all the time I needed and that opportunities would be waiting when I was ready. That exchange gave me something I hadn't felt in years. Hope that there was life beyond this marriage, beyond being James's decorative accessory. At home, James had started getting careless. He'd always been careful about hiding his affair, but now, with the promotion seemingly secure, he got sloppy. His phone would buzz with messages at dinner, and he'd smile at the screen before putting it away. Twice, I saw Brittany's name flash across his screen before he could dismiss the notification. He probably figured I wouldn't understand the significance even if I saw it. One evening, his phone rang while he was in the shower. The caller ID showed B Finance. I didn't answer, but I watched it ring, counting 8 rings before it went to voicemail. When James came out, I mentioned someone from finance had called. He barely reacted, just said it was probably about some budget numbers and he'd call back later. The casual dismissiveness of it all was almost worse than the affair itself. He didn't even care enough to be careful anymore. I was that invisible to him. Ashley called on day 22. Everything was ready. The papers would be served at his office the following afternoon, right after the ethics complaint was filed with HR. The timing was deliberate. We wanted him blindsided, professional and personal life exploding simultaneously. No time to prepare a defense for either front. That night, I made James's favorite meal again. Steak, roasted potatoes, the expensive Cabernet he liked. He barely looked up from his laptop during dinner, responding to my attempts at conversation with distracted one-word answers. At one point, I asked him directly if everything was okay between us. He looked genuinely confused by the question, assured me everything was fine, then went back to typing emails. I went to bed early, telling him I wasn't feeling well. He nodded absently, said he'd be up late working anyway. I lay there in the dark, listening to him typing in his office down the hall, and felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no regret, no second thoughts, just a calm certainty that tomorrow would be the first day of my actual life. The next morning, James left for work in a particularly good mood. He was wearing his newest suit, mentioned he had an important presentation, actually kissed me goodbye instead of his usual distracted wave. He told me he'd probably be late because he was taking the team out for drinks after work to celebrate the Berlin partnership. I wished him good luck with the presentation, told him to have fun at drinks, watched him drive away in his Tesla, completely oblivious. Then I poured myself coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and waited for Ashley's text confirming the papers had been served. My hands were steady when my phone finally buzzed at 2:47 p.m. 3 words from Ashley. "It's done." James called me 17 times in the next 2 hours. I didn't answer any of them. Let him panic. Let him wonder. Let him feel even a fraction of the confusion and betrayal I'd felt sitting in that restaurant, listening to him destroy me in a language he thought I didn't understand. When he finally came home, I was packed and ready. My attorney had advised me to leave the house that night to establish physical separation. I'd already rented a furnished apartment downtown, already moved my most important possessions there over the past week while he was at work. I heard his car screech into the driveway, heard him slam the door. When he burst into the living room, his face was red with fury and confusion. He started shouting immediately, demanding to know where I'd gotten information about offshore accounts and Brittany, accusing me of hacking his computer or hiring investigators to stalk him. I let him run out of steam, watched him pace and rage and sputter. Then I spoke to him in German, clear and precise, every word articulated perfectly. I told him I'd understood every single word at dinner, every insult, every confession, every casual dismissal of our marriage, that I might be decorative, but I was far from dumb. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might actually pass out. James stood frozen in our living room, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, fear, rage, denial, all fighting for dominance. He opened his mouth several times, but no sound came out. For a man who'd spent 12 years talking over me, around me, and about me, he suddenly had nothing to say. I switched back to English, keeping my voice level and cold. I told him I was leaving, that he'd be hearing from my attorney about everything else, and that he should probably focus on dealing with the HR investigation his company had just launched. Then I picked up my purse and the small suitcase I'd staged by the door, and I walked out of that house for the last time. He didn't try to stop me, probably still processing that his simple little wife had just destroyed his entire life in German. The furnished apartment Ashley had helped me find was small but perfect. 10th floor, views of the Sound, everything I needed and nothing I didn't. That first night alone felt surreal. No footsteps overhead in his office, no distant sound of keyboard typing, no feeling of being a ghost in my own home. Just silence and space and the beginning of something new. James's calls and texts started around midnight. The first few were angry, demanding I come home immediately and explain myself. Then they shifted to confused, asking how I'd even learned German without him knowing. By 3 a.m., they'd become desperate. He claimed there were misunderstandings, that I'd taken things out of context, that we could work through this if I'd just talked to him. I blocked his number at 4 a.m. and finally slept. Ashley called the next morning with an update that was better than I'd imagined. James's company had moved fast. Once HR received our complaint with the detailed documentation of his relationship with Brittany, they'd immediately placed him on administrative leave. The ethics violation was clear-cut. He was a senior manager, she was a junior analyst in his department, and they'd failed to disclose the relationship as required by company policy. The offshore accounts and potential financial fraud made it even worse, suggesting he might be misusing company resources or connections. But the real masterpiece was Patricia's forensic report. She'd traced not just the $400,000 in offshore accounts, but another $180,000 that James had funneled through a series of shell companies. Money from our joint accounts, from his bonuses, from the inheritance his father had left him 3 years ago that he'd claimed was only $40,000. Money that should have been marital property, hidden away like I had no right to my own financial security. Patricia had also discovered that James had opened a credit card in my name without my knowledge, racking up $30,000 in charges for his trips with Brittany, hotels, restaurants, jewelry, even a weekend rental in Napa Valley. He'd been making minimum payments from our joint account. So I'd never noticed, but legally he'd committed identity theft and fraud. Ashley was practically gleeful when she explained how badly James had miscalculated. His attempt to hide assets had created a paper trail that proved not just the hiding, but the intent to defraud me in an eventual divorce. That turned what might have been a standard asset division into a case where he'd likely lose far more than half of everything. Washington courts didn't look kindly on spouses who tried to cheat the system. Over the next week, I watched James's life collapse in stages. His company fired him on day 3. Ashley got the documentation through discovery. They'd found evidence that he'd been using his corporate credit card for personal expenses, including dinners with Brittany that he'd claimed were client entertainment. Combined with the ethics violation and the investigation into his offshore banking, they'd decided he was a liability. They terminated him for cause, which meant no severance package, no extended benefits, nothing. Brittany was reassigned to a different department but kept her job. Apparently, HR determined she'd been the victim of a workplace power imbalance. I didn't care about her fate either way. She was welcome to James's wreckage. Mr. Dietrich reached out again during week 2. This time he called directly, speaking in German first, then switching to English when I answered. He told me he'd heard through business channels about James's termination and wanted me to know the Berlin deal had been canceled. His company didn't work with organizations that tolerated ethical violations, and James's firing had reflected poorly on the entire operation. Then he made me an offer I hadn't expected. His company was opening an American headquarters in Seattle, and they needed a director of marketing who understood both American and German business culture. Someone who could bridge the cultural gap, who had experience in the tech sector, and who had demonstrated integrity in difficult situations. The salary he mentioned was 30% more than James had been making. I didn't accept immediately, told him I needed to see through the divorce first. Make sure my head was clear before making major career decisions. He respected that, said the position would remain open for 3 months while I sorted my personal situation. Meanwhile, James was spiraling. His attempts to contact me had evolved from angry to desperate to pathetic. He started showing up at my apartment building, but the doorman had strict instructions not to let him up. He tried calling my friends, my coworkers, even my mother in Phoenix. Everyone had the same response. They supported me, and he should respect my boundaries. His lawyer tried negotiating through Ashley. They wanted to settle quickly, offering me 60% of marital assets to avoid a lengthy court battle. Ashley laughed and countered with 80% plus full restitution for the credit card fraud, plus legal fees, plus damages for emotional distress. They scoffed at first, until Patricia's forensic report landed on their desk. After that, their tune changed considerably. James's parents called me in week 3. His mother was crying, begging me to reconsider, saying I was destroying their son's life over a misunderstanding. His father was more direct, accusing me of being a gold digger who'd trapped James in marriage and was now cashing out. I listened politely for about 90 seconds, then told them their son had committed fraud, adultery, and identity theft, and that I'd heard him describe me as decorative furniture to a business associate. His mother went quiet. His father hung up. The divorce process ground forward with the inevitability of a glacier. Washington State required a 90-day waiting period from filing to finalization, which meant I had months of legal maneuvering ahead. But Ashley was confident. Every piece of evidence we had was solid, every financial trace documented, every lie exposed in black and white. James tried one final desperate move in week 4. He filed a counter-complaint claiming I'd been having an affair, that I'd somehow manipulated the financial records, that his conversation at the restaurant had been taken out of context. His lawyer withdrew from the case 2 days later. Probably realized James was lying about everything and didn't want to risk his license representing obvious fraud. I spent that time rebuilding. Started therapy to process 12 years of emotional neglect and manipulation. Reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with because James had always been too busy or too tired for social events. Took German conversation classes just for the joy of speaking it openly, without hiding. Started running in the mornings, something I'd given up years ago because James complained about me leaving early. The woman looking back at me in the mirror wasn't the same woman who'd sat in that restaurant 4 weeks ago. She was stronger, clearer, done apologizing for taking up space. James's second lawyer finally convinced him to settle. 75% of marital assets to me, full restitution for the credit card fraud, plus he'd be responsible for all legal fees on both sides. The offshore accounts would be returned and divided according to the settlement. He'd also agreed not to contest the divorce or make any further allegations against my character. The day I signed the settlement papers, I felt lighter than I had in years. Ashley opened a bottle of champagne in her office, toasting to victories hard won. She told me she'd been practicing family law for 15 years, and this was one of the most satisfying cases she'd ever handled. Watching a man who thought he was clever get completely outmaneuvered by the wife he'd underestimated. That night, I called Mr. Dietrich and accepted his job offer. 3 months after that dinner where James thought he was safe, I'd left the marriage with my finances secure, my reputation intact, and a career opportunity that exceeded anything I'd imagined possible. And James was unemployed, professionally blacklisted in Seattle's tight-knit tech community, and facing potential criminal charges for the identity theft. Sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need when you're brave enough to take it. The weeks following the settlement signing should have felt like victory, but instead, they felt like preparation. Ashley had warned me that James might try to hide assets or violate the terms, that men like him often couldn't accept losing control. So we kept building documentation, kept every text message, every email, every attempt he made to contact me or circumvent the agreement. Patricia continued her forensic work even after the settlement was reached. She'd found something troubling in the offshore accounts that warranted deeper investigation. When she called me into her office in early November, her expression was grim. James had been moving money longer than we'd initially discovered. Patricia had traced transactions going back 5 years, not 2. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, always from accounts I had legal access to but never checked because James had convinced me he was better with finances. Over 5 years, he'd siphoned nearly $700,000 into various offshore holdings. The settlement had been based on the $400,000 we'd originally found. This changed everything. Ashley immediately filed a motion to reopen the financial discovery. James's new lawyer, a tired-looking man named Gregory Walsh, tried to argue that the settlement was final and binding. The judge disagreed. When one party had systematically hidden assets during disclosure, the settlement could be modified to reflect the true financial picture. James finally had to sit for a deposition. I wasn't there, but Ashley recorded it and played me the highlights later. Watching James squirm as Patricia walked him through every transaction, every wire transfer, every lie about his financial behavior gave me a satisfaction I didn't know was possible. He tried claiming the money was for investments, for our future, for retirement accounts. Patricia calmly showed him documents proving he'd told his offshore banker the accounts were in preparation for divorce. The man had been planning his exit strategy for 5 years. While I was trying to save our marriage, going to couples counseling that he'd suggested, working on myself because he'd convinced me I was the problem, he was systematically stealing from both of us to ensure I'd be left with nothing when he finally left. That revelation hurt worse than the affair. Brittany was just symptom of a much deeper sickness. James hadn't fallen out of love with me. He'd never loved me at all. I'd been a convenient cover story, the stable wife who made him look respectable while he built his escape plan. Ashley filed for a complete modification of the settlement. She also filed for sanctions against James for fraud and perjury during the original disclosure process. The new demand was 90% of all marital assets, full recovery of the hidden $700,000, and punitive damages for the years of systematic deception. James's response was to finally crack completely. He started posting on social media long, rambling rants about gold-digging wives and corrupt family court systems. He claimed I'd seduced him when he was vulnerable after his father's death, that I'd been controlling and manipulative throughout our marriage, that I'd isolated him from his friends. None of it was true, and everyone who actually knew us could see the lies. His friends started distancing themselves. His mother called Ashley's office begging her to make it stop, saying James was having some kind of breakdown. His posts got worse. He claimed I'd been having an affair with Ashley, that the whole divorce was a lesbian conspiracy to steal his money. He posted photos of our house, claiming I'd vandalized it when I moved out, though he couldn't provide evidence because I'd actually left it immaculate. He even tried to post financial documents, attempting to prove he was the victim, but all they showed was exactly what Patricia had already documented. Ashley got a restraining order within 48 hours. James was prohibited from posting about me on social media, contacting me or anyone in my family, or coming within 500 feet of my apartment or workplace. He violated it 3 days later by showing up at my apartment building again. The doorman called the police, and James spent a night in jail for contempt of court. That seemed to finally penetrate his delusion that he could somehow win this. The modified settlement hearing was scheduled for mid-December. Ashley spent weeks preparing, organizing every document, every transaction record, every piece of evidence showing James's 5-year plan to defraud me. Patricia built financial models showing exactly how much wealth James had hidden and how it had grown in various investments while I'd been living on a tight budget because he'd convinced me we needed to be careful with money. The cruelty of it was stunning. Years of telling me we couldn't afford vacations, that I should buy clothes at outlet stores, that we needed to eat in instead of going to restaurants, all while he was sitting on $750,000 in hidden wealth and taking Brittany to expensive hotels. I'd been living like we were struggling while he'd been living like a rich man with a secret second life. The day before the hearing, Mr. Dietrich took me to lunch. We'd been communicating regularly about the new position, and I'd already started consulting part-time on the American expansion plans. He wanted to ensure I was holding up under the pressure of the legal battle. Over schnitzel, ironically, he told me something that reframed everything. He said he'd seen hundreds of business deals go bad, watched partners betray each other, witnessed fraud and deception at every level. But the thing that always amazed him was how often the architects of these schemes underestimated the intelligence of the people they were betraying. They got so caught up in their own cleverness that they forgot other people could be clever too. He told me James had made that fatal error at dinner that night. He'd been so confident in his deception, so secure in his belief that I was too simple to understand anything important, that he'd literally confessed to multiple crimes in front of me. Most people who committed fraud had enough sense to hide it completely. James had announced it over wine and appetizers because he genuinely believed I was incapable of comprehending what he was saying. That arrogance, Mr. Dietrich said, was what separated winners from losers in business and in life. Winners stayed humble enough to respect their opponents. Losers assumed everyone else was stupid. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Ashley presented a case so airtight that James's lawyer barely bothered to cross-examine. Patricia walked the judge through every hidden account, every false statement, every year of systematic theft. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen too many cases like this, grew visibly angry as the evidence mounted. When it was over, the judge didn't just modify the settlement. She awarded me 92% of all marital assets, full recovery of the hidden funds plus investment returns, $50,000 in punitive damages, and ordered James to pay all legal fees, including Patricia's forensic accounting charges. She also referred the case to the state attorney general for potential criminal prosecution of the identity theft charges related to the credit card fraud. James would walk away from our 12-year marriage with roughly $60,000 and a criminal investigation. I would walk away with over $1 million in assets, a new career, and my self-respect fully intact. Ashley hugged me outside the courtroom. She told me most of her clients got justice, but rarely did they get this level of complete vindication. The judge had essentially ruled that James's behavior was so egregious, so calculated, so deliberately cruel that he deserved to lose almost everything. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt exhausted and sad. Not for James, but for the woman I'd been 5 months ago. The one who'd believed love meant accepting crumbs, who'd thought marriage required making yourself smaller so your partner could feel bigger, who'd convinced herself that loneliness in company was better than loneliness alone. That woman had died in a German restaurant in June. The woman who'd taken her place was done accepting anything less than she deserved. December brought an unexpected kind of peace. The legal war was essentially over, just paperwork and financial transfers remaining. James had finally gone quiet, probably on his lawyer's advice, possibly because he'd run out of energy for fighting. I'd moved into a larger apartment with actual furniture I'd chosen myself, pieces that reflected my taste instead of James's minimalist aesthetic that had always felt cold. The job with Mr. Dietrich's company officially started in January, but I'd been consulting throughout December, helping shape the American expansion strategy. It was refreshing to work with people who valued my input, who asked my opinion and actually listened to the answers. The German team appreciated my language skills, and the American side respected my understanding of the local tech market. But the real work of December was internal. Therapy twice a week with Dr. Sarah Kim, who specialized in helping people recover from emotionally abusive relationships. That's what she called it during our 3rd session. Emotional abuse. I'd resisted the label at first, thinking abuse required visible bruises or dramatic fights. Dr. Kim explained that systematic diminishment, financial control, and isolation were all forms of abuse. James had spent 12 years making me smaller so he could feel bigger. Understanding that reframed everything. The way he'd dismissed my career aspirations, convincing me to take the lower-paying coordinator role instead of pursuing management positions because it would mean more flexibility for his schedule. The way he'd managed all our finances and made me feel stupid when I asked questions. The way he'd gradually disconnected me from friends who'd questioned his treatment of me. The way he'd made fun of my interest in learning German, turning something meaningful to me into a joke about wasting time. Each revelation in therapy was like removing a layer of fog. I could finally see clearly what had been done to me, and more importantly, how I'd been conditioned to accept it. Patricia called mid-December with the final financial accounting. The asset transfer was complete. After legal fees and taxes, I was receiving approximately $3 million. Money I'd helped earn, but had been told we didn't have. Money James had stolen systematically while telling me we needed to budget carefully. Money that represented not just financial security, but freedom from ever being dependent on someone who saw me as decoration. I used part of it to pay off my student loans, something James had always said we'd get to, eventually. Felt incredibly good to eliminate that debt immediately. Set up a retirement account properly structured for the first time in my life. Created an emergency fund that could cover 2 years of expenses. The rest went into diversified investments Patricia recommended, with enough liquid assets to feel secure and adventurous at the same time. Christmas came quietly. I told my mother everything by then, flying her up from Phoenix for a week. She stayed in my guest room and helped me pick out furniture and cook meals I'd forgotten I loved because James had been picky about food. She told me she'd never really liked James, that she'd sensed something cold in him but hadn't wanted to interfere in my marriage. I didn't blame her. I'd sensed it too, but had convinced myself I was being unfair. James's mother called me on Christmas Eve, not to argue this time, but to apologize. She told me she'd gone through James's childhood room at their house and found journals from high school. In them, he'd written about how he planned to find a wife who would be attractive enough to impress people, but not ambitious enough to challenge him. He'd been strategizing this since he was 17 years old. She was crying as she told me this. Said she didn't know where she and her husband had gone wrong, what had made James so calculating and cruel. I told her it wasn't her fault, that people made their own choices. But privately, I wondered how many other women James had dated before me, how many he deemed too ambitious or too smart or too confident for his purposes. I'd been the perfect mark. Young enough to mold, ambitious enough to have earning potential, but not so ambitious that I'd outshine him. Trusting enough to believe everything he told me about finances and appropriate behavior. I'd even looked the part he wanted, professional but not too glamorous, attractive but not so beautiful that other men would pursue me aggressively. He'd chosen me like someone picks out furniture for a staged house. The State Attorney General's office contacted me between Christmas and New Year's. They were moving forward with identity theft charges related to the credit card fraud. It was a felony in Washington, and with the documented evidence Patricia had assembled, they felt confident in prosecution. They needed me to testify about my lack of knowledge of the account, but otherwise, the case was solid. I agreed to testify, not out of vindictiveness, but because what James had done was a crime, and crimes should have consequences. If I didn't press charges, he'd probably do the same thing to the next woman. Men like him didn't reform without serious intervention. Ashley and I celebrated New Year's Eve at a rooftop bar in downtown Seattle. She brought her wife, Melissa, and I brought my newly rediscovered sense of humor. We toasted to new beginnings, to women supporting women, to the satisfaction of watching abusive men face actual consequences. Melissa, who was a trauma therapist, told me I was handling the aftermath remarkably well. Most people who left long-term abusive relationships struggled for years with self-doubt and grief. I told her the anger helped. Being righteously furious at what had been done to me kept me moving forward instead of looking back. Dr. Kim had said the same thing, that anger was a healthy response to injustice as long as I didn't let it consume me. I wasn't consumed. I was motivated. The final divorce decree came through on January 3rd. 12 years of marriage officially dissolved. I'd kept my maiden name professionally throughout the marriage, so there wasn't even a name change to process. The house in Bellevue was being sold, proceeds split according to the settlement terms. I'd taken everything from it that mattered to me, which turned out to be remarkably little. Some photos from before the marriage, books I'd bought with my own money, a few pieces of art I'd inherited from my grandmother. Everything else could burn for all I cared. The furniture James had chosen, the kitchen gadgets he'd insisted on, the expensive electronics he'd bought to impress visitors. None of it meant anything. It was all just props in a performance I'd unknowingly been trapped in. Mr. Dietrich invited me to dinner the night the divorce finalized. He wanted to properly celebrate my new freedom and discuss the formal terms of my position as director of marketing. We went to a different German restaurant this time, a smaller place in Ballard with checkered tablecloths and the kind of authentic atmosphere that tourists never find. He ordered in German, and I responded in the same language. The waitress's eyes lit up, clearly pleased to speak her native tongue. We spent the first hour just talking about food and culture and the strange experience of being an immigrant in America. It wasn't romantic, just comfortable. Two people who understood what it meant to exist in multiple worlds at once. Over dessert, he brought up that night at the fancy restaurant in June. He told me he'd known something was wrong when he saw my hands. I'd been gripping my napkin under the table so tightly my knuckles were white, and my smile hadn't reached my eyes. He'd suspected I understood more than James realized, but he hadn't been certain until I'd contacted him after the divorce filing. I asked him why he'd offered me the job. Was it pity? Charity for the wronged wife? He looked genuinely offended. Told me he'd offered me the job because after researching my professional background, he'd realized I was exactly what his company needed. Someone with real marketing experience in the American tech sector. Someone who understood German business culture. Someone who could communicate across the Atlantic divide. The fact that I'd also demonstrated grace under pressure and the intelligence to execute a complex legal strategy just confirmed he'd made the right choice. That night, walking back to my apartment through the cold January air, I realized I'd spent 12 years of my life being told I wasn't smart enough, ambitious enough, or valuable enough. And in 6 months, I'd proven every one of those statements wrong. I'd outsmarted a man who thought he was the clever one. I'd built a career opportunity that exceeded anything I'd had before. I'd created a financial foundation that meant I'd never be dependent on someone else's goodness again. The next morning, I started my first full day as Director of Marketing for Dietrich Industries' American Division. My office had windows overlooking Elliott Bay. My salary was more than James had made at his peak. My team reported to me because they respected my expertise, not because a company org chart forced them to. And somewhere in Seattle, James was unemployed under criminal investigation and facing the reality that the woman he'd treated like decoration had destroyed him completely, using nothing but intelligence, patience, and fluent German. Sometimes revenge isn't a dish best served cold. Sometimes it's best served in the language your abuser didn't think you could speak. The criminal trial began on a gray February morning. Washington versus James Mitchell. 1 count of identity theft, 1 count of credit card fraud. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and institutional, filled with the kind of quiet tension that comes before something important happens. James sat at the defense table in a suit I didn't recognize, probably borrowed since he'd sold most of his wardrobe. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt and drawn. He didn't look at me when I entered, just stared straight ahead like if he didn't acknowledge my presence, this whole nightmare might disappear. His third lawyer, a public defender named Rachel Ortiz, who looked exhausted before the trial even started, had tried one last time to get him to take a plea deal. The prosecutor had told my victim advocate that they'd offered 6 months county jail and probation. James had refused, insisting he'd never meant to commit identity theft, that it was a misunderstanding about marital finances. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Chen, had warned me that testifying would be difficult, that James's lawyer would try to make me look vindictive, that they'd paint this as a bitter divorce where I was weaponizing the legal system. I told her I understood, but I was doing this anyway. Not just for me, but for the next woman who might be fooled by James's act. The trial's first day covered the technical aspects. Patricia testified about discovering the credit card, tracing the charges, proving that I'd never signed the application or authorized the account. The credit card company's fraud investigator confirmed that the signatures on file didn't match mine. Bank security footage showed James at an ATM making cash advances on the card while I was at work. It was all damning evidence, but academic, numbers and documents and timestamps. The prosecution was building a fortress of facts that James couldn't dispute. On day 2, I took the stand. Amanda walked me through the basics first. How long we'd been married, our financial arrangement, the way James had always managed money. Then she asked when I'd first learned about the credit card. I explained finding it in Patricia's forensic report, months after our separation, discovering $30,000 in charges I'd never made for trips and gifts that had been part of my husband's affair. She asked me to explain some of the specific charges. I went through them methodically. The hotel in Napa Valley that James had told me was a solo research trip. The jewelry purchased on Valentine's Day when he'd said he was too busy for dinner. The romantic restaurant charges from nights when he'd texted me he was working late. Each item felt like reopening a wound, but I kept my voice steady. This wasn't about my pain anymore. This was about establishing that James had systematically used stolen identity to fund his secret life. Then Amanda asked the question we'd prepared for. She wanted me to explain why I believed this was intentional identity theft rather than a misunderstanding between spouses. I took a breath and told the truth. I explained that James had managed all our finances, that he'd convinced me to give him control because he was better with numbers, that I'd trusted him completely with every aspect of our financial life. Then I described finding evidence that he'd been planning to leave the marriage for years, hiding assets, building an exit strategy that left me with nothing. The credit card was part of that strategy. He'd opened it in my name so the debt would be tied to me when he eventually left. The charges would have appeared on my credit report, damaged my financial standing, while he'd walk away clean. It was calculated and cruel, designed to punish me even after he was gone. Rachel Ortiz's cross-examination was gentler than I'd expected. She asked if it was possible James had simply made a mistake, opened the card thinking I'd approve, forgotten to tell me about it. I said no because he'd hidden the statements and made payments from an account I never saw. She asked if I was angry about the divorce. I said yes, but not about the divorce itself, about the betrayal, the lies, the years of being manipulated and diminished, about discovering that the man I'd loved had been systematically stealing from me while making me feel small. She asked if I wanted to see James go to prison. I paused before answering that one, looking directly at him for the first time since entering the courtroom. I told her I wanted James to face consequences for his actions, that I wanted him to understand you can't treat people like objects, steal their identity and their dignity, and walk away without accountability. Whether that meant prison or probation or community service wasn't for me to decide. That was for the jury and the judge. But yes, I wanted him to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't build a life on lies and expect it to stand forever. James finally looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in our entire marriage. I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret or might have been self-pity. With James, it was always hard to tell where genuine emotion ended and performance began. The trial lasted 3 more days. James took the stand in his own defense, trying to claim the credit card was for our joint benefit, that the charges were all innocent misunderstandings. The prosecutor tore his testimony apart with receipts and travel records and text messages between him and Brittany making plans for trips funded by the stolen credit. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on both counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. James would likely get somewhere between 6 months and 2 years, depending on the judge's discretion and his lack of prior criminal history. His lawyer would argue for probation, but with the evidence of systematic fraud and the civil case showing years of financial deception, prison time seemed likely. I left the courthouse that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in months. Not happy exactly, but satisfied. The legal system had worked. A man who'd committed crimes faced consequences. Justice might be slow and imperfect, but sometimes it actually functioned. Ashley met me at a coffee shop near the courthouse. She'd been there for the verdict, sitting in the back of the courtroom as moral support. She told me I'd been incredible on the stand, calm and credible and completely unshakable. That watching me hold my ground under cross-examination had been inspiring. I told her I'd had a good teacher. She'd prepared me for every possible question, every tactic the defense might use. But more than that, she'd reminded me that I had nothing to be ashamed of. James was the one who'd committed crimes. I was just the woman who'd had the courage to report them. That night, I cooked dinner in my apartment with the windows open despite the February chill. Made my grandmother's recipe for sauerbraten, the German pot roast she used to make for Sunday dinners when I was young. The smell of vinegar and spices filled the apartment, bringing back memories of her kitchen in Phoenix, of feeling loved and valued and seen. She died 5 years ago, but I thought about what she might have said if she'd lived to see all this. She'd survived World War II in Germany, immigrated to America with nothing, built a life through sheer determination. She'd have been proud, I thought, not of the divorce or the legal battles, but of the woman who'd refused to accept being diminished. I ate dinner alone, savoring every bite, and felt grateful for the inheritance she'd left me. Not money, though that came later, but the knowledge that you could survive anything if you remembered your own worth. James would be sentenced in 3 weeks. I didn't plan to attend. That chapter was closed. My new life had already begun. James received 18 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 3 years of probation. His lawyer had argued for probation only, citing his clean record and claiming he'd already suffered enough through the divorce. Judge Martinez disagreed. She stated that identity theft was a serious crime, that James had shown no genuine remorse, and that a strong message needed to be sent about financial abuse within marriages. I didn't attend the sentencing. Ashley went on my behalf and texted me the outcome. I was at work, in a strategy meeting about the German expansion, when the notification came through. I glanced at it, felt a brief moment of satisfaction, then returned my attention to the presentation about European market penetration strategies. That probably sounds cold. Maybe it was. But James had already taken up 12 years of my life. I wasn't going to give him another minute. The months that followed were about reconstruction, not just of my life, but of my sense of self. Dr. Kim and I worked through layers of conditioning I hadn't even recognized were there. The way I'd learned to make myself smaller in conversations, always deferring to others' opinions. The way I'd stopped advocating for raises or promotions because James had convinced me I should be grateful for what I had. The way I'd apologized constantly, even for things that weren't my fault, because keeping peace had become my default setting. Unlearning those patterns was harder than I'd expected. Even in meetings where I was literally the most senior person present, I'd catch myself starting sentences with, "I'm sorry, but," or "this might be wrong, but." Dr. Kim gave me homework. Notice every time I apologized unnecessarily and replace it with a direct statement. Turns out I'd been apologizing roughly 40 times a day. The work with Dietrich Industries exceeded every expectation. The American expansion was ambitious, requiring careful coordination between German engineering culture and American tech market realities. I thrived in that bridge role, translating not just language, but entire business philosophies between two continents. Mr. Dietrich, who insisted I call him Klaus after the first month, trusted my judgment completely. When I said the Seattle market needed a different approach than Silicon Valley, he listened. When I advocated for hiring a more diverse team than the German headquarters had imagined, he not only agreed, but made it a company-wide initiative. By summer, we'd opened offices in Seattle and Austin, hired 47 people, and secured 3 major contracts with American tech companies. My bonus alone was more than I'd made in 2 years at my old job. Klaus told me during my 6-month review that I was the best hire he'd made in 20 years of business. The criminal trial fallout reached further than I'd anticipated. 2 other women contacted me through Ashley, both ex-girlfriends of James from before our marriage. They'd seen news coverage of the trial and recognized his name. One of them, a woman named Rachel, who dated James in college, told me a story that was eerily similar to mine. He'd controlled her finances, isolated her from friends, made her feel stupid and inadequate. She'd escaped after 2 years, but had always blamed herself for being too weak to make the relationship work. Hearing that she blamed herself made me angry in a way the crimes against me hadn't. I invited both women for coffee, and we spent 3 hours comparing notes about James's patterns. The lies he'd told, the manipulation tactics, the way he'd systematically dismantled their self-confidence. It was a masterclass in psychological abuse, perfected over years of practice. We reported everything to the prosecutor's office, though there was nothing criminal they could charge from relationships that had ended years ago. But the documentation mattered. It established that James was a serial abuser, not just a man who'd made one mistake in one marriage. That information would be relevant if he ever tried this with someone else. I also started volunteering with a local women's shelter, teaching financial literacy classes. So many women in abusive relationships stayed because they couldn't see a path to financial independence. I taught them how to secretly build credit, how to hide emergency money, how to document financial abuse for divorce proceedings. Every class felt like honoring the woman I'd been 2 years ago, the one who'd felt trapped and powerless. Klaus's wife, Margaret, became an unexpected friend. She was a physician who'd immigrated to the U.S. 30 years earlier, and she understood the particular challenge of navigating between cultures. Over lunch one day, she told me something that shifted my perspective entirely. She said Americans often viewed marriage as a completion, the goal at the end of a story. But in her experience, marriage was just one chapter in a much longer narrative. Some chapters were beautiful, and some were mistakes, but they were all just chapters. The story continued regardless. I'd spent a year thinking of myself as divorced, as if that were an identity. But I was so much more than that. I was Jessica Rivera, Director of Marketing, German speaker, survivor, volunteer, friend, daughter. The divorce was just one chapter in a story that was far from finished. My mother visited again in September, this time staying for 2 weeks. We took a trip to Munich, visiting my grandmother's birthplace, walking streets she might have walked as a girl before the war. We ate schnitzel at beer gardens and practiced my German with patient locals who appreciated the effort even when my grammar failed. It was the kind of trip James would have dismissed as unnecessary, too expensive, not practical enough. Fuck practical. I was learning to live for joy instead of optimization. The credit card debt had been erased through the criminal restitution order. The offshore accounts had been recovered and distributed. The house in Bellevue sold for well above asking price in Seattle's hot market, giving me an additional windfall I immediately invested. By the time the 1-year anniversary of that dinner arrived, I had over $1. $8 million in assets, a career trajectory that excited me daily, and a sense of self-worth that nobody could take away. James got out after serving 14 months with time off for good behavior. I knew because his probation officer contacted me as required, ensuring I was aware of his release and confirming the restraining order remained active. He'd moved to Portland, apparently, living with his parents while trying to rebuild his life. Part of his probation required steady employment and counseling for financial crimes. I didn't know if he'd actually change, but it wasn't my concern anymore. Klaus offered me a promotion in November. Vice President of North American Operations, overseeing not just marketing, but the entire American expansion. It meant more responsibility, significant travel, and a salary that would have made James's head explode if he knew. I accepted immediately. That night, I went back to the German restaurant where it had all ended. Not the fancy place where James had confessed his crimes, but the small Ballard spot where Klaus and I had celebrated my divorce. I ordered Sauerbraten and a good German Riesling and sat alone at a table for 2, perfectly content. The waitress, recognizing me from previous visits, asked if I was waiting for someone. I told her no. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. She smiled and said she'd bring me the best dessert they had on the house. Over plum cake and coffee, I thought about that woman sitting in the other restaurant 18 months ago. The one gripping her napkin and maintaining her smile while her world collapsed in a language her husband didn't know she spoke. She'd been brave that night, braver than she'd realized. She'd kept her composure, gathered her information, and executed a plan that destroyed the man who'd tried to destroy her. I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to her. To the woman I'd been, who'd found the strength to become the woman I was now. My phone buzzed with a text from Klaus. The Berlin office wanted to set up a video call to discuss the Asian expansion strategy. He thought my perspective on bridging cultural and business differences would be invaluable. Did I have time tomorrow? I texted back immediately. Always. Outside the restaurant windows, Seattle sparkled in the November rain. Somewhere in this city, there were probably other women sitting at dinner tables, smiling politely, while their husbands dismissed them in languages they didn't think their wives understood. Somewhere there were women feeling trapped and small and convinced they deserved the crumbs they were getting. I couldn't save them all, but I could be living proof that you could escape, that you could rebuild, that the man who tried to make you small could end up losing everything while you thrived. If you're watching this from somewhere you don't feel valued, where you're being told you're too simple or too dumb or not enough, listen carefully. You are enough. Your instincts that something is wrong are probably right. And when you're ready to stop accepting less than you deserve, there are people who will help you build the escape plan. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so good that your abuser becomes irrelevant. It's proving that everything they said you couldn't do was just their fear talking. It's learning to speak the language they thought you'd never understand, and using it to dismantle everything they built on lies. James wanted a wife who would be decoration, who would stay in her place, who would never threaten his carefully constructed world. Instead, he got me. And I destroyed him in German. Subscribe if this story resonated with you, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what language are you learning that someone doesn't expect you to know? Because knowledge is power, and power belongs to those brave enough to claim it. Zum Wohl, to health, to wealth, to the life you deserve.